Hello again. This is Muskham History Group with a social lockdown special. A few months ago we celebrated VE Day, and now we've got something else to celebrate: the end of World War II. VJ Day happened on the 15th of August 1945. 75 years approaches. Or 75 years has just passed if you're looking at this after the date. VJ Day, 15th of August 1945, officially ended the Second World War, but in England it did not have the impact of VE Day. VJ Day had happened thousands of miles away, and the only real concern that the British people had in 1945 was the return of the prisoners of war. Australia had been bombed and for a time was directly in the firing line for invasion. The fight for New Guinea and the Coda Trail had been desperate, particularly for the Australian and New Zealand troops. Through our own carelessness, we had lost Singapore and Malaya and Hong Kong. But the Dutch and the French had lost significant parts of their empires, and the USA had been somewhat unceremoniously thrown out of the Philippines. For Britain, the greatest threat had been to the jewel in the British crown, when the Japanese threatened to drive through Burma and invade India itself. We had heard something of the contempt in which the Japanese held their prisoners, and there were rumours about cruel conditions on the Burma Railway. Those with family and close friends who were captured during the first days of the war in Singapore and Hong Kong, and later during the Burma campaign, were worried about what news the victory would bring. We had not yet heard of the code of the Bushido Knights, nor did we know of the Japanese punishment of decapitation. Pearl Harbor had been a great gamble for the Japanese that had not paid off, but it roused the Americans to a terrible mood for vengeance. In fact, it was the Americans who took the leading role in the island-hopping War of the Pacific and the eventual direct attack on Japan itself. It is curious and fortunate that Hitler quickly followed Japan in a declaration of war against the USA. In a single move, he guaranteed that sooner or later both countries would be defeated. And Roosevelt's agreement that Germany was the greater threat to world democracy, and his strategy of putting Germany first, meant the war would probably be over by 1948 at the very latest. It was a simple economic calculation. It took no account of the fighting spirit of the countries involved. Germany, Italy, and Japan could not win a war against the world with the USA's arsenal behind it. Japanese goals in the war were all short to medium term. Japan had no industrial scale of natural resources. There was no coal, no oil, no rubber, and no iron on commercial scales. These resources could only be captured by going to war. The only problem was that the USA had an interest in Pacific and Southeast Asian politics since they had won the Philippines War of 1898. Yamamoto's plan was to strike the US fleet in Pearl Harbor immediately after war was declared and before the Americans could react. With the US fleet out of action, the Japanese could establish their Co-Prosperity League across Manchuria, China, and Southeast Asia. They could then give the Philippines back to America, and perhaps other areas too, as their fleet was rebuilding to a threat level. The Co-Prosperity League, perhaps with Australia and India included, would continue to place Japan as a major world power. Unfortunately, the declaration of war came after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had had trouble interpreting their codes, typing out the messages, and getting the Americans to meet with them. And now Yamamoto knew at that moment that the war would be lost. And the Americans went on to build a fleet much after the Japanese style, with aircraft carriers as the predominant capital ships and battleships in support. Unfortunately, the legends of the samurai and the ashigaru were deeply embedded in the Japanese psychology. Never surrender. Surrender is a sign of moral weakness. Be dead to your family. Never expect to come home. The Japanese who went to war took with them the shawl of 1,000 stitches, which was their burial shawl. They were not expected to bring it home to their family. Your service to the Emperor lasts as long as the war, so once you are stationed on the front line, you cannot expect home leave. You cannot expect to see your family again. To take a life as you die is honourable. These ideas were reinforced in 1941 by a popular Japanese film concerning the 47 Ronin. The 47 Ronin is a story about 48 samurai who served their lord, who was ordered to be executed because he drew his sword in the shogun's palace. Because their lord had been executed, the samurai were banished to the Ronin class, and they vowed to revenge their master. The story tells of the 3 years that the 47 Ronin spent planning and scheming to bring about the death of their enemy. And then they all committed suicide at the order of the emperor. It's a misunderstanding of the truth to say the atomic bombs caused Japan's surrender. Hiroshima and Nagasaki cost around 180,000 casualties. Remember, no one knew about the terrible toll radiation would take as yet. That happened some time after the war. And Japanese cities have been suffering casualty rates of 50 to 100,000 casualties a night since March and April of 1945, when General Curtis LeMay had switched the US bombing assault to low-level firebombing with napalm. Individual Japanese were frightened, but very few would dare to ask for mercy. The Emperor had decreed this war. None but the Emperor could bring it to an end, and no soldier in the field knew what was happening on the Japanese mainland. And no one on the Japanese mainland knew what was happening on the battlefields. When the Americans attacked Okinawa, it is believed that the Battle of Okinawa cost the Japanese over 120,000 soldiers and a further 100,000 civilians who were killed in the crossfire or committed suicide because of their fear of being captured by the Americans, or were used as human shields as the Japanese carried out desperate attacks against the Americans. The Kamikaze Attacks took another 1,400 pilots, a loss rate that could not be sustained as Japan was literally running out of trained pilots. If you look carefully at that picture, you can see a Japanese Zero diving in to attack the American cruiser. And no one reported the defeat because no one went back home. The defeated general on Okinawa preferred to commit seppuku. Okinawa was the first Japanese island to be taken by the Americans. It cost the Americans 80,000 casualties. As part of the Yalta Agreement, the Soviet Union came into the Japanese conflict at 11 p.m. on the 8th of August 1945. A little bit late, you might say. But a beautifully executed plan made 3 major offensives that captured Manchuria, Manchukuo, Inner Mongolia, Northern Korea, Karafuto, and Kuril Islands. Whilst the Americans threatened invasion from the south, the Soviet Union could now threaten a multi-point attack onto the Japanese mainland from Manchuria. And the bombings will continue, with the Americans apparently able to destroy a city with a single bomb. And the raw materials the Japanese were fighting this war for have all been lost. The military government and the senior army command still advocated victory or death. Even as the emperor decided his country had suffered enough and intended to announce Japan's surrender on the radio in person, a group of young army officers tried to imprison him and announce the continuing struggle. Fortunately, they were captured and imprisoned. Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender. His people had never ever heard his voice before, and many could not believe what he announced. But the emperor's word must be obeyed. Aboard the USS battleship Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, with the arrogant theatrics that were his trademark, General Douglas MacArthur declared these proceedings to be at an end. An interesting use of the English language. These proceedings to be at an end. It was a great celebration in America. Even the Russians seemed to be glad that it was over. And for the British, it was an excuse to go on parade. The American newspapers headlined the event. Although Mr. Truman seems to have got the date wrong, but it was the end of the war. So, keep up your spirits. We are not actually at war today. Coronavirus isn't warfare. And we will meet again. Bye now.